Good lunchtime, almost afternoon. Thank you everyone for coming today. We are very pleased to know the level of interest there is in what citizens and legislators, legislative staff can do about federal overreach, or what I'm calling today when the feds go rogue. I first would like to thank the TPPF staff, everyone who's here helping and organizing, and especially Mike Joyce, who helped us create this entire event. So thank you very much, TPPF. I've worked around and in for several organizations like this, and I have never met a staff so dedicated, hardworking, and smart. I mean, so many of these people I work with are just darn smart. So it's really a lot of fun. Also, we're hoping that today you're taking away from this some things that you can talk about, some things that you can actually act on. And so we're very, very thrilled to have some expert panelists with us. I'll tell you a little bit about our format up front so you're sure that there will be some time for your questions at the end. We're all going to present remarks and then maybe discuss a little bit of what was said amongst ourselves, just answering a few questions that may come up during the course of our comments, and then we'll open the floor to questions from the audience. So I encourage you to have those prepared. I will be kind of laying some groundwork and some background first, and then our other two speakers will follow. I'm going to introduce them now so that we can just roll into their remarks. So if you will help me appreciate the fact they're there as soon as I've introduced them, that would be great. First of all, we have TCEQ, Texas TCEQ Chairman Brian Shaw. And he taught as associate professor in the biological and agricultural engineering departments of Texas A&M. He has taught courses focused on air pollution engineering. The majority of his research concentrates on air pollution abatement, dispersion model development, and emission factor development. Dr. Shaw was formerly associate director of the Center for Agricultural Air Quality Engineering and Science, and served as acting lead scientist for air quality and special assistant to the chief of the U.S. Department of Agriculture Natural Resources Conservation Service. Dr. Shaw also served as member of the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency Science Advisory Board Committee on Integrated Nitrogen. I don't think I could last 5 minutes on that board. The EPA SAB Environmental Engineering Committee and the Ad Hoc Panel for Review of the EPA's Risk and Technology Review Assessment Plan. Additionally, he's a member of the U.S. Department of Agriculture on the Agricultural Air Quality Task Force. Professor John Hayes has a background in government, academia, and private practice of law. His government experience involves serving as examiner, which is an administrative law judge with the Railroad Commission in Texas. He is a partner at the Hayes & Owens law firm in Austin. Mr. Hayes teaches as an adjunct professor of energy law at the University of Texas School of Law. Mr. Hayes has written and lectured on energy law, regulation, and litigation for groups such as the State Bar of Texas, the Department of Energy, and the Interstate Oil and Gas Compact Commission. Please help me thank our two experts. I'm Karen Lugo, and I'm director for the 10th Amendment Action Center at TPPF. Today I will offer some general remarks on the existential challenges that states face from this administration and its agendized agencies, with specific focus on constitutional concerns based in the EPA's proposed Clean Power Plan. As a constitutional law appellate brief writer and instructor, I've worked with some of the nation's leading scholars and attorneys to defend state police powers and constitutional separation of powers principles. After studying America's founding history, leaders, and writers, I am confident that we have reached a crossroads in this nation, and only resolute leadership will determine whether America continues to recognize any shred of state sovereignty and the vital voice of local management. Ladies and gentlemen, this is not business as usual. We are not here today to talk about federal power grabs in theory, but in terms of harsh reality. The House of Representatives has just taken the unprecedented step in voting to sue the administrative branch over what are essentially violations of constitutional separation of powers. Congress is beginning to find its voice and is heeding the cries of constitutional scholars like even Professor Jonathan Turley, who generally supports the administration's policies, but is desperately urging congressional action to defend its own turf. This legal action will possibly reinforce respect for Congress, but it will not aid the states that are victim to egregious federal authority grabs and overreaches, and states must independently address serious balance of powers violations together as a band of resolved and united states. While we are here to talk primarily about the EPA's proposed Clean Power Plan, the title of this session is When the Feds Go Rogue. And I would like to provide some background on what the BLM has been doing, as the headlines have been more focused on the Clean Water Act and the Power Plan as violations of congressional authority. As we are all aware, in Texas, probably more so than other places, the BLM is conducting a resource management plan for the states of Texas, Oklahoma, and Kansas, a total of 263 million acres of planning area, which includes a decision area of almost 700,000 acres, plus over 5 million acres of federal mineral estate lands. The brewing Red River area dispute over whether the federal government planned to take property currently deeded to private owners is really just a footnote in this very large and ambitious study that involves much public land and energy reserves. Yet it is still important to look at why there was a controversy over what would happen to the property held in the Red River Basin, and that the BLM may claim as federal land or land held in trust for Indian tribes. There is also public land in this area that may require heightened management per BLM concerns over drug traffic and litter, according to the BLM's published report thus far. Records of public comments collected by the BLM reportedly express near unanimous opposition to anything other than very restricted public access or hunting on the public multi-use land. As far as the private property interest, the BLM has done much to allay concerns about private property in the Red River area, calling the RMP, or the Resource Management Plan, simply a refresher, quote. And state and local representatives report that BLM officials have provided much comfort and reassurance that that's simply what they are doing is refreshing their rules. But as Western states will tell us, and I have been calling them to find out what has been happening in a variety of other states, Wisconsin, Arizona, Montana, Utah, most of these again in the West, but this is where the BLM has been most active. The BLM has undergone these RMPs in these other states, and so it's important to look at the ones that have recently been reported. Within the last year, you can go to the websites for Wyoming and Arizona, and you can see how these reports have greatly restricted. Even though we already have the Endangered Species Act and the protected land for the endangered species, these reports generally entail an increase as far as the amount of acreage and the kinds of restrictions on this property. But in having conversations with these Western states, I've asked, what do you do when faced with something like this that is going to be a final decision at the point that it's announced? How do you anticipate what may happen, especially when you consider that some of the standards being used, and you can find this on the BLM's website, some of the standards used are things like environmental justice and cultural sensitivity. So how to challenge even in a court of law when there's so much discretion entailed in terms like this, and it leaves an agency a tremendous amount of power. So these Western states have said, well, what we have started to do is to ask the BLM up front in writing to commit when they tell us that all they're doing is a refresher, then take some things off the table and tell us up front what it is that you actually plan to do. And of course, the BLM has declined to do so thus far with any of the people that I have talked to. Yet, when it comes to Texas, I think it is increasingly important because of the amount of land discussed and what's at stake in the Red River area, that Texans are emphatic about the fact that they want to know exactly what is being considered. And the reason that I encourage this, when you look just days ago at the fact that the BLM testified in Congress And the whole issue was whether the private property would be protected when these are deeded landholders that have had the land in their families for generations. The testimony first opposed provisions within the bill that the BLM characterized as protecting private owner land when it may be public land unless there was payment to the U.S. taxpayer. So if these property lines are in question, which they must be because the BLM is saying they're going to do a survey, so if they're going to perform a survey after all these decades, and the fact that the river has moved over the course of miles, I've looked at all these maps and gone through all the old court cases, and so the riverbed, which the government owns part of, has moved as well. So what was riverbed is now not even close to where the river is. So when these surveys are done, it is likely that there will be land that is currently privately held that will be in dispute. So it then sounds like the BLM is saying here that the federal government must then be compensated before those deed holders, the title holders, are to receive the recognized title to their land. So something that we have to be watching, this, I don't think they would be discussing surveys or questioning whether there is money owed to the federal government for land that would be called public land unless some of that land that's currently private will be in question. So to consider what, and I'm going to tell my timekeeper right now that I'm really sorry, but I don't think any of us are going to quite make it as far as our time constraints. And I'm going to talk really quickly, but in part of my calling around, I talked to people in New Mexico. And I don't know how many of you are aware, but they recently woke up to a situation like that was experienced in Nevada, where overnight fences went up and cattle were restricted from accessing water. Now, this is a result of these kinds of sue and settle situations where normally if a new regulation is placed, it's a matter of notice and process and hearings and people know what's coming. When it's a sue and settle arrangement, typically overnight the new fences go up or the new protections are designated, or of course there's some government review as to which animals get which heightened protections, but it can be a matter of a community being very surprised. So in this case, the county commissioners voted the sheriff authority to cut the bolts on the gate and let the cattle have access to water. At that point, the federal government, very concerned that there might be another situation like what happened in Nevada, decided to come in and hold a mediation hearing. Now, none of this is shocking to me up until this point. When the mediation hearing was scheduled by the DOJ and the U.S. Attorney in the area for New Mexico, the local Congressman Steve Pierce announced that he would attend. Now, you would think he'd be the first to be invited, since one is representative of those people, but two, it is the Congress that is to oversee the agencies and any overreach, and so if there's a concern of heavy-handedness, Congress should be the first party involved in a mediation. But no, Congressman Pierce was told, don't come. In fact, if you do come, we will cancel the meeting. So you are not welcome, you will not be allowed here. We will cancel the meeting if you show up. I am talking to his chief of staff tomorrow, but to me, as a constitutional scholar, teacher, it is critically important that we're defending separation of powers. And I do not understand a congressman backing away from his responsibility to be there, nor the administrative branch through the DOJ telling a congressman he could not be at such a meeting. So anyway, the reports of the meeting were that it was simply a matter of the government telling the ranchers this is the way it will be. Didn't really resemble much of what you would usually consider a mediation would look like. This was happening at the same time that New Mexico is being sued by the federal government because the government in New Mexico, state government, passed a resolution saying that New Mexican authorities could clear areas around the federal forest where the lands are not being properly maintained and a fire hazard has been created. So as soon as they began to step in and do what the federal government was supposed to be doing, the DOJ came in and sued New Mexico. So again, there is a controversy where states have stepped in to defend their own police powers and to accomplish the health, safety, and welfare duties that they owe their people, and they're sued by the federal government. Now, both these things are brewing. Days after the sheriffs are told they are authorized to cut the bolts on the fences, the administration in Washington announces that New Mexico will have a new federal national monument. Now, New Mexico had expected 60,000 acres to be allocated to monument land. No, it was 500,000 acres that New Mexico had designated as monument land. Now, I don't know, coincidence maybe. But it certainly, if it's not a coincidence, is an example to other states. And so it is so important that we are understanding that New Mexico and other western states, they're in a battle. In fact, Utah will be the first to sue in January of next year to have their federal lands, or public federal lands, restored. And so New Mexico is a state that has just seen this matter go into the legislative process. I think it was just introduced 2 weeks ago. So even though Texas does not have this concern, our sister state, New Mexico, does. And this is an issue that we're talking about over $1.5 trillion of economic possibility, access to resources in those states, and local management, where the people do have more of a say about what goes on. Briefly, I'm going to talk about a few issues with the Clean Power Plan and the constitutional concerns that we should have as Americans when an agency goes so far off the statute to say we have authority to completely transform the way energy is produced in your state and allocated in your state, and yet there is no congressional statutory authority to do this. I'm going to move quickly here. So, and while I'm not an energy attorney, what I'll be looking at, and other panelists will look at more of the details of the Clean Power Plan and how it will affect Texas, if allowed to, if it is enacted, and that's what I want to talk about, is how we can stop it. But my reading of the Constitution, of our constitutional history, says that the Founding Fathers would have called this power plan the Intolerable Act of 2015. If the Clean Power Plan is not rejected now by a significant number of resolved states, there may be no other opportunity to stop this wholesale centralization of energy administration. In fact, if the Clean Power Plan is imposed as currently described and stands as a precedent for federal usurpations that states will tolerate, there may be no other time or place that states will reassert sovereign interest beyond this one transfer of power. The EPA has already moved outside of the authority provided by the Clean Air Act to regulate greenhouse gases and to regulate these emissions at existing sources, rather than what was intended, just newly constructed generating units. A series of court cases have done little to limit the EPA's ambitions to the terms of the Clean Air Act. So now the EPA continues to invent authority by claiming that Section 111D of the Clean Air Act provides authority to regulate existing generating units for greenhouse gas emissions, even though those were already regulated under Section 112. Now, the EPA itself has admitted that this stretch would have been unrecognizable to the Congress that designed the governing statutory framework. The EPA has similarly admitted that its interpretation of the Clean Air Act conflicts with a literal reading of the law. Yet this administration remains determined to impose some kind of cap-and-trade-based regulatory system that will target carbon emissions, even though the House defeated a cap-and-trade bill and Senator Reid pulled a similar bill when there were not enough votes in the Senate. Also, Australia has reversed course and abandoned its cap-and-trade plan in the face of insignificant emission reductions and staggering costs. Germany and the European Parliament have also backed away from carbon reduction schemes that proved to be prohibitively costly. Of course, California, where I come from just 6 months ago, is reckoning with the fact that the first year of cap and trade cost them $1 billion in carbon tax. It's very important for Texans to also understand that the comparatively stringent energy swapping formula for this state is not calculated to count existing wind energy production, since 2012 is the baseline for calculations, and Texas wind power generation was already online by that time. When a federal agency acts to preempt state authorities, the EPA does here by relegating states to the position of mere field offices with the dramatically altered assignment of swapping energy production sources to meet an arbitrary formula. The Supreme Court has announced that there must be express congressional will. We quote, "We start with the assumption that the historic police powers of these states were not to be superseded unless that was the clear and manifest purpose of Congress. Moreover, the Supreme Court has recognized that Section 111D of the Clean Air Act generally allows, quote, each state to take the first cut at determining how best to achieve EPA emission standards. In June, the United States Supreme Court spoke directly to the EPA about assuming too much power in what was the Texas v. EPA case, when it warned that the EPA should not, quote, bring about enormous and transformative expansion in EPA's regulatory authority without clear congressional authorization. It is as if Justice Scalia was providing foundational instruction to the states for meeting this challenge in the Clean Power Plan when he also wrote that Congress, not a federal agency, must speak clearly if it wishes to assign to an agency decisions of vast economic and political significance. Also, the EPA has disregarded congressional instructions found in the Clean Air Act, where it provides that each standard of performance must take into account the costs. Yet there is no such safe harbor provision in the EPA's proposed Clean Power Plan. Instead, it intends to impose upon Texas an anticipated 50% reduction in coal generation and 150% increase in renewable energy sources. Oklahoma's Attorney General Pruitt has spoken to the defects and overreach in the Clean Power Plan, and he filed suit a week ago with 11 other states. Maybe that Texas is thinking of going it alone on this one, or with some other states. Texas is not included in this total of 12 states yet. But he has filed suit to defeat the imposition of this new rule, and he's also offered his own alternative plan that we have available at the back of the room, and he's assessed the plan as the current plan from the EPA is devoid of authority to fundamentally alter traditional state regulatory power to implement federal emission standards at the source and inside the fence, where states have the expertise and the history to set energy priorities. The side of generation is where states may also best assess local interests, plant tolerances, and ratepayer imperatives. And consider that many state agencies would be in violation of state law if they attempted to comply with this EPA rule. I will let other panelists explain that further. Under EPA's Clean Power Plan, the agencies with expertise in these critical matters will no longer be in charge. If states do not formulate an en masse response, the EPA will become the de facto sole energy regulator in the United States. Congress must heed coordinated state political action. Legal action is a backup, but we'll be talking today about the fact that it is not a predictable nor hopeful backup at all times. So, before states are regulated out of the energy equation, Congress must urgently speak to what authority the EPA is to have, if at all, to supplant state administration. Even courts will recognize the joint commitment of many states to speak directly to agency abuse of authority. This plan must be called void for lack of congressional grant of authority by at least the number of states that banded together to sue over Obamacare's federalism violations. A significant number of states must rise to this challenge together, but the statement must be political and rather than legal this time, since a court remedy is not likely to address the core overreach. I am working with a Texas legislator to craft a bill that will call the Clean Power Plan void until Congress speaks. As Chief Justice Roberts said in the NFIB or Obamacare decision, as he wrote in his opinion when he addressed the Commerce Clause part of the opinion and addressed then the power of the states, he wrote that the states are separate and independent sovereigns. Sometimes they have to act like it. Well, if this is not the time, and this is not the initiative to stand against in solidarity with many other states, it is hard to imagine a challenge that is going to be more urgent. Thank you.
Good morning. Thank you for the opportunity to be here, and thank you, Karen, for breaking into a lot of the topic areas that I think I'll be hitting on. I do appreciate the chance to visit on what is a very important issue, but I'll try to be brief, but I think it's fair for me to warn you, or maybe to apologize up front. I may make some of you uncomfortable during my comments. I don't know if you know this or not, but I grew up extremely shy and was terrified of public speaking. But I'm making my way from being an introvert to being an extrovert. For those of you who don't understand my background, I'm an engineer, agricultural engineer, And you may not realize that you can have extroverted engineers, but it has been pointed out to me that, as you may know, introverted engineers stare at their shoes while they're talking to you. Extroverted engineers stare at your shoes while they talk to you. So if I make you uncomfortable by staring at your shoes during my discussion, then I apologize now. I hope that you can bear with me on this. But in all seriousness, thank you for the chance to visit about this issue. It's one that it's clear that we're seeing a long-term slide, if you will, of what is granted to the states and authority being usurped, grabbed by, and further the federal government is taking that away from the states. I think we're seeing in more recent times an acceleration of that process. I'll try to speak about why, I guess sort of as a foundation, why that states' rights and that state sovereignty is not just the law, but it's a good idea. I think that's something that's sort of been missed, is that we so often seem to have, when we make these arguments, there seems to be this perception that as long as it's legal, as long as the courts say it's not a step too far, that it's okay for the federal government to continue to grab that authority away from the states. But I would argue if you look at the fundamentals of why the states need to have that authority, it becomes pretty clear in some of the recent issues we've dealt with. And that is, I think that cooperative federalism, while it may not be perfect, certainly that component of cooperative federalism that gives the states authority to determine how to meet those federal requirements, recognizes that state sovereignty and that state right issue. And the reason it's a good idea, not just the law, is because it leads to better programs, better policies, better regulations than if you have the federal government, as they're moving more and more toward now, dictating more of a one-size-fits-all, or at best a one-size-fits-region, where they may divide the states into different regions and set those rules out. I think obviously the states being the grounds for developing and having the opportunity for the free market to develop solutions and innovation and to be able to customize approaches to fit the state leads not only to a better fit in the state. In other words, for example, from the regulatory standpoint, it leads to better environmental regulations that are more cost-effective, that get the results faster, better, and tend to lead to less of the unintended consequences that we try to avoid. We probably couldn't have a better example than we have with regard to the latest rulemaking that has been proposed by EPA with regard to greenhouse gases, specifically those existing sources. Because what we see in this case is one of the biggest leaps I've seen EPA take on regulatory action. Just to sort of paint you a picture to make sure that you sort of understand the process that's taken place and how that works, let me briefly go into some of the changes and challenges from historic application of the 111D section of the Clean Air Act. Historically, when EPA has gone through that analysis for a source, for a given pollutant, one, there's a whole argument about whether 112, as was mentioned by Karen, even allows EPA to get there, but let's assume that EPA prevails on that matter. Historically, as EPA has looked at that, for example, if you're looking at NOx, SOx, or some pollutant of concern, they look at the source category. In this case, we're looking at fossil fuel power plants. And in fact, historically, they looked at coal-fired power plants separately and even subcategorized and looked at lignite versus other coal power plants. And the analysis was, what is the best system of emissions reduction? You may hear BSER mentioned a lot. What is the best system of emissions reduction which meets certain criteria about being technically feasible, being economically appropriate for applying to that source to get those reductions? EPA's process is very limited from 111D of the Clean Air Act in that their role is to determine how that performance standard, what is the goal, that they get to provide an answer to that question. But the states are granted more flexibility in this arena than even in other arenas of the Clean Air Act to determine how to implement that. And so the EPA, if you will, in past cases would have looked at BSER for greenhouse gases for coal-fired power plants. They would have said, what controls can you put in place on this power plant that will reduce the pollutant of concern or the emissions of concern, in this case greenhouse gases? That's where EPA's authority should start and end, in my opinion. And so then the states would be able to determine what the best process is to meet those standards. What happened in this case, though, is that EPA had what they've heralded as unprecedented input from the states, which is true. They had many, many meetings. Even though the time frame was very shortened, they had many states and many opportunities for the states and others to give input. One of the things that I warned about all along, and it turns out, unfortunately, I was right, was that EPA would take our suggestion that we're claiming that authority that's given in 111D, that we have the flexibility of states, that they would take that and use that against us. And in fact, what you see EPA has done is instead of setting the standard based on what controls could be placed on a facility, in this case a coal-fired power plant or a natural gas-fired power plant, what they've done is said, you've asked for all this flexibility, so we're going to give it to you. We're going to let you do things like adjust how you dispatch your electricity for states that want to say we're going to dispatch. In other words, we'll generate from cleaner burning sources from a greenhouse gas standpoint first, and then we'll use coal later. So instead of giving states that flexibility, EPA said, we're going to force you to take that flexibility. We're going to set a standard based on what controls we think you can put on the plant, which I disagree with and think is overly ambitious to begin with. But they're going to add on to that what reductions they think by saying, okay, coal-fired power plants, you don't get to generate your electricity first based on economics, which is what we do in the state of Texas. But instead, first, the cleaner, the less emitting greenhouse gas sources, such as natural gas plants, they would be dispatched first. If there's enough demand for electricity, then you can fire up the coal-fired power plant. So that's what they call building block 2. But then they go further. And beyond even the category they're dealing with, they say what building block 3 will be is it's saying that even if you're a natural gas-fired power plant or a coal-fired power plant, you don't get to generate first based on economics, but instead those zero-emitting greenhouse gas plants. So we're talking about nuclear, wind, and solar primarily. And nuclear is kind of a base load and a cheap energy, so it tends to run base load anyway. It's always running, and then you sort of pile on top of that based on economics. But wind and solar are different critters there. What we have when we basically are saying we're going to dispatch any renewables first is that you basically have coal can only run if and when you can't meet your demand elsewhere. That completely turns on its head the way the free market system works, and specifically the way the competitive energy-only market works in the state of Texas. And so what that says now is not only do you only get to run coal if everything else that you have available is online and you're still not meeting the demand, but you also have to do that in a way that we don't understand for sure how that's going to work, because coal plants aren't good for peaking, where you bring them all up and down quickly. Coal tends to be operated as a base load plant, and some of the things that EPA is assuming is that they're going to operate just as efficiently when we change that operating parameter to where they're peaking plants instead of a base load type operation. Those are all unfounded and going to cause, I think, unknown at this point consequences from the standpoint of emissions as well as maintenance and reliability, and so there's a lot of concerns with that. However, one last point I'll make just to be brief on time. It's interesting to me as we see this process going along where the federal government in this rule is going to give us all this flexibility. If you go through it, and the last block I didn't mention, I should briefly, is that you can also get there by using energy efficiency measures, by replacing light bulbs or doing other things to use less electricity. Again, you can do those things, but EPA gave you the flexibility, therefore they also added how much they think you can get and added all those to your goal. So the goal and what Texas has to reach overall, by the way, is about I believe it's 42% reduction from 2012 levels. So we're going to have the largest emissions reduction of greenhouse gas of any state across the U.S. And the reason is, they said, not only the BSER for the power plant, but also by dispatching natural gas or cleaner burning fuels first, and by dispatching nuclear and wind and solar first, and then by applying all these energy efficiency measures, you're going to get even greater reductions in your greenhouse gases. To the point, and this is critical, there's two components of the way EPA regulates these sources that are new sources under 111B and 111D. 111B is for new sources. They did this earlier, and that's going to be litigated. But for a new coal-fired power plant, for example, they've already developed their rules, and they're being litigated at this point for how clean those have to be, and the same for natural gas plants. Here's something that's interesting. The process for new sources is they go through this analysis to determine what control technologies, and they go through this evaluation of economic feasibility and what have you. While I disagree with what they came up with, they have set those standards. The standard for a new coal-fired power plant is 1,100 pounds of CO2 per megawatt hour. That's how much CO2 you can emit for every megawatt hour you send down the wire. That would also include carbon capture and storage, which is not proven technology, but nonetheless EPA requires that. For a natural gas combined cycle, which is the cleanest of our generating capacity we have today that we could build, it's 1,000 pounds of CO2 per megawatt hour. What they've done with the state for existing sources, which arguably the Clean Air Act was written and handled those sources differently so that you didn't jeopardize sources that are in existence by making it infeasible for them to continue operating. But what that means for Texas with regard to our existing coal-fired power plants and the natural gas plants we have in our fleet would be 791 pounds of CO2 per megawatt hour. So effectively, we could not replace our existing source with any technology and be able to meet the standard that they're dictating through 111D of of standard. It does not make sense to do that, to have a standard that arguably would be for those sources that exist, and you have this economic reasonableness that would make it where you couldn't even replace them with the cleanest burning and get there. And so it's unfounded that EPA is having this outreach or overreach, and I'm concerned that if this is not contested, if we don't dispute this, if we don't win, that the implications on greenhouse gases, as bad as they are, is only the camel's nose under the tent, if you will, because they're going to then, I think, use this authority to change the way they analyze other pollutants of concern, and effectively they can deny coal and or natural gas down the road because they can compare it to other sources if they're choosing to say, well, if you, for NOx or SOx or others, of other pollutants of concern, even though coal you can't get there with this, we think you should no longer be a coal-fired power plant. You need to be wind, you need to be nuclear, you need to be something else, which would be fine if we had processes perhaps in place where we could build coal-fired power plants. Last point, I know I've already gone through my last point. This is really my last point. One of the things that's interesting is you see the discussion about how Texas is a winner and how this is going to be a good thing for Texas and our economy, and how not only are we going to be able to meet all these standards, but the cost of electricity is actually going to go down. And the point that comes to mind for me from that standpoint is if all of this is so good and so cost effective, why hasn't our free market system led to us getting there? And probably the answer I've come up with, and you've probably all thought the same thing, how many times have you seen a business or an economy or some sort of business plan that's operating and is barely making or is not making all the strides that it can, and you think, if only the federal government would get involved in managing this. Because we know that if the federal government were here, it would be so much more efficient. But that's effectively what we have, is that the federal government is saying the free market is not going to get you to the point where this cheaper, lower cost energy is available, but somehow by putting this onerous rule in place, not only are we going to get all these emissions, which I would argue are really going to be transferring emissions from the U.S. to China and India and other places, which if you're concerned about greenhouse gases, it doesn't matter whether they're emitted in Texas, California, U.S., or India or China. Really what we're doing is sending those jobs, that economy overseas, and we're missing the opportunity to use that natural resource, to use that boon to our economy, to develop the next clean energy source, to develop that process whereby in the long run, greenhouse gas emissions are also decreased, but probably more so than this top-down approach. But more importantly, other pollutants of concern are reduced because of the efficiency associated with that. And perhaps most importantly for those who want to reduce greenhouse gases, I would contend that you'll actually reduce global emissions of greenhouse gases more by developing technologies here that make us use energy more efficiently and more effectively that then the Chinese, the Indians, and others will adopt in order to be competitive. And so instead of them just taking coal and burning it the way they've always burned it, they would have to use those new energy technologies to be competitive, and we would benefit not only from the greenhouse gas side of that, if you're believing that we need to be putting our eggs in that basket, but more importantly, from where my heart is, we would also reduce those other pollutants of concern that we know we see in the streets of China, and you see those pictures of the pollution they have there, and they would be able to hopefully attain the environmental benefits that we have in the U.S. So with that, I know I covered a lot of ground, but thank you all, and thank you for bearing with me as I stared at your feet. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman Shaw and Ms. Lugo. My background is largely in energy law and policy and practice, heavy on oil and gas, some electricity, some of the rest of it. One of the things that I've observed to folks in recent years is it's almost impossible these days, in fact I'd say it is impossible to represent oneself as an energy lawyer without also becoming an environmental lawyer. We see it probably most directly in the oil and gas area with rules primarily administered by the Railroad Commission governing the way wells are drilled and completed and oil field wastes are disposed of. We're also seeing it with this clean power proposal from the EPA writ large over the entire energy sector. And as Chairman Shaw talked about becoming more efficient, what I was thinking is, yes, energy not only is the lifeblood of modern prosperity and moving away from centuries of high infant mortality deaths and mortality rates and abject poverty, which of course still is predominant in many areas of the world. We have hundreds of millions, if not billions of people without electricity at all in India and China and third world countries. And we tend to get a little bit arrogant at this end, thinking, well, we've got it and it's all great, nobody else in the world should have the benefits of energy. And then we start talking about things like CO2 reductions and leaving aside the debates about the science of global warming and the extent of the problem. One thing we do know very clearly is some of these proposed command and control programs are extraordinarily expensive. And as Bjorn Lomborg, the Swede, has written in a marvelous book, Cool It, he sets up a chart and he says, look, he believes that global warming is occurring and is caused by mankind. But we got to stop and think about, are all these programs that are awesomely expensive, are they feel-good programs or are they do-good programs? And he talks about the fact that for all the money that is proposed to be spent on many of these programs, such as the one the EPA is proposing, if we really want to do good in the world, we would spend that money on third world sanitation systems, and vaccination programs, and education programs, and gosh, maybe even leave some of the money in the hands of individuals to spend on their families, and churches, and to communities to exercise what is almost archaic sometimes these days when we talk about freedom and liberty. But the fact of the matter is, energy has brought us tremendous good, and by the same token, it is because of the nature of energy generation, primarily through fossil fuels, or what are called fossil fuels, natural gas, and then coal, of course. That's the source of large amounts of CO2 emissions. But Chairman Shaw referred to the fact of becoming more efficient in market solutions. And one thing that is also widely misunderstood is while, yes, energy consumption overall in this country has gone up, this country has grown tremendously. Our capabilities have grown tremendously. And the fact of the matter is, based on numbers directly from the Energy Information Agency, which I'm as skeptical as the rest of the folks about some of the stuff the federal government does, but the EIA overall has done a pretty good job of putting together numbers. They seem to have some remarkably intellectually honest folks doing some of that. And the reality is, since at least the mid-90s in this country, the energy use per capita has decreased. And literally since at least 1980, and that's as far back as the chart I have in front of me goes, the energy use per dollar of gross domestic product has also decreased. And why is that? Well, it's not because of centralized government programs requiring greater efficiency in automobiles and different light bulbs, but it's rather because overall we've simply become more efficient. And why is that? Well, there's this thing called trade where private individuals make choices in what we call the market to do what they think is best, and the principal mechanism and transmitter of information where they make those choices are prices. And folks like to pay less. I don't know anybody that's going to go out and pay $10 for a gallon of gasoline if they can get it for $4, or pay $10 for a movie ticket if they can get it for $5. Good reason. The more money we save on one thing is the more money we have on other things. It's not some mysterious process that has to be trumped by government planning. It's the way liberty and people work. And the economists, many of them got off the track for years with notions that the only way good things could happen would be by massive central planning. Unfortunately, there's been a lot of rethinking of that, and folks are starting to appreciate that many of these problems, the reality is, are simply too complex for central planning. A different way of putting it is nobody is smart enough. And to do it that way, they don't know enough, they don't have the information, and they're never going to have it, and there are not enough computers in the world to do it. And besides that, the relationships and the variables, not to mention the hard data, is constantly changing, even if we have it. So what we have with the Clean Power Plan, and as we talk about massive government programs, this is what we're talking about. It's not as long as Obamacare, but it's not pretty. And that leads to a number of challenges of its own. First and foremost, it's hard to understand And some of the best minds around are the first to say that, it's very intricate, contorted, elaborate. There are lots of, dare we say, hidden agendas in it, and it's not easy. And that indeed is one of the major problems with our modern administrative state, is to get control of it and manage it. It's very costly. It takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of study, it takes a lot of resources. And even within a given agency, I'm sure Chairman Shaw has had the experience of trying to find out just what the heck is going on within his own agency, and realizing that a lot of it is very opaque, and folks don't always level with you, even if they understand it. And the cost, if we want to talk about it in economic terms, is very high. And that's where bureaucracies grow and flourish. And individuals, as we know, just because they go in government employ, don't change fundamental human nature of greed, avarice, pride, arrogance, sometimes laziness. People are people. And so a lot of these theories, and the reason I'm talking about this is that's behind things like this, is that somehow these administrative agencies are going to be staffed by the best and the brightest, and by God, they can figure out things and understand things and do it in a way the rest of us are just too plain stupid to understand. And particularly if we're at the state level, we don't get that extra dose of brilliance that comes from moving to Washington, D.C. And we just have to supervise the poor, dumb states. Well, that's not what our constitutional system is all about and what it was based on. Unfortunately, there was a movement that started over 100 years ago, and one of the champions was Woodrow Wilson, who wrote a book when he was still a professor at Princeton called Constitutional Government of the United States, published in 1905, where he was arguing how we had outgrown the basics of the constitutional framework and we needed to rethink the whole way it works so that the best and the brightest people, principally at the federal government level, could end up running everything to make us all better off. So it has a long heritage. It's unfortunate that over the time, particularly starting in the 30s, it became incorporated into the legal system, and the U.S. Supreme Court created over time whole sets of ways of reviewing agency decisions and even congressional legislation that has, in many respects, eviscerated our constitutional system. There are a lot of folks that would like to see it get back, but it's not there yet. And that, I'll conclude with some remarks on why litigation in this area and to fight this is very important. We'd be foolish to put all our eggs in that basket. To recap, and for us lawyers, the legal arguments and the constitutional arguments are fascinating, but we also need to always take stock of what is this thing going to do as best we can figure out at this point. And some of these numbers have already been mentioned, that Texas would bear 18% of the projected national reduction in CO2 emissions under the EPA plan. Think about that. We're one state, now granted we're the largest state, next to Alaska in terms of area. We have a large population, but still we would bear 18% of the reduction. And the cost of that reduction will be tremendous, and we'll talk about that. That amount of reduction that Texas would bear is 3 times what it would be for Florida, which is the #2 state in terms of the burden of reduction. So it's not trivial at all. I believe Chairman Shaw mentioned it would eliminate 50% of the current production of electricity from coal, and coal accounts for about 1/3 of our current electric production in Texas. And yes, I like natural gas. My natural gas producer clients like natural gas. But the reality is we have an incredible invested base in coal generation, and coal can be done in a manner which is pretty clean these days. It's not like the old pictures of the smokestacks in England or Pittsburgh or anyplace else. And it's just crazy to think that the EPA is saying we need to junk dozens of existing coal plants that can produce electricity that we use for lights, to charge our iPhones, just name it, what we use electricity for. One of the things that's built into the EPA plan and the way they do the calculations and scenarios and models, and one thing that I like to point out to people is, while I'm certainly not a particular fan of John Maynard Keynes, the economist, he made the observation one time, he said, never base policy on a prediction. And if you go even to the EIA numbers of their energy forecasts for different components over the years and GDP forecasts, they're never right. They're always wrong. And that's because these things are too complex to predict with any degree of certainty. But that hasn't slowed down the EPA from modeling and projecting, for instance, what Texas could get by increasing the use of renewables in this state dramatically, and that means principally wind and to a lesser extent solar. And gosh, it turns out that, first of all, this modeling and this projection and then building it into the plan where they say you can do this, Texas, to reduce by 18%, if you, for instance, include the construction of massive new wind farms, which of course are incredibly expensive. The EIA has published the numbers on it. The full life cycle cost for energy from wind is about $95 a megawatt hour, which is about 50% more than new combined cycle natural gas plants. And that doesn't even count the building and transmission lines and the subsidies on top of subsidies. But the way the EIA did it is particularly pernicious because it uses the year 2012 as a baseline. Well, Texas, for a variety of reasons, has been one of the leaders in installing wind power in West Texas and elsewhere. And so by 2012, Texas had 12,000 megawatts of installed wind generation capability, leader in the country. So EPA has chosen 2012 as the baseline to say we got to go way beyond. Texas get no benefit for what Texas has already done at considerable expense. This would significantly increase the cost of electricity. It would leave what in the utility regulatory area we refer to as stranded costs. Coal plants that are no longer used, parts of the electric grid that were put in place for a coal plant in a given location that are no longer usable if that coal plant goes down and can't be used. It would require both the TCEQ and the Public Utility Commission to do things like moving to dispatch based on environmental factors as opposed to price factors that they simply don't have the authority to do under the current Texas statutory framework. So what the EPA is in effect saying is if you want to play ball on this thing, and if not, we'll take the ball away, is that the legislature has got to pass legislation to do what maybe the legislature would not otherwise do, indeed move away from the competitive energy market that we've so wildly moved to over recent years. And again, this environmental dispatch instead of economic dispatch cannot be understated. It's like the EPA telling you that when you go to buy a new car, you got to buy it based on the lowest emissions as opposed to the lowest price. And that's not to say we don't need some emission controls, but it's to say it's focusing on a non-economic factor that may cause, in fact, absolutely causes far more expenditure of resources that when they're expended on one thing, can't be expended on something else. And that's something we tend to forget about in a lot of economic discussions. It's a principle the economists call opportunity cost, is that if I spend $100 going out to dinner, that's $100 I don't have available for something else. It's all about choices. Now, what about the lawsuit route for curing this? And Ms. Lugo mentioned that, and we talked about it. And I certainly support what the Attorney General of Oklahoma is doing in trying to sue. But let's don't, overstate or over-expect the results out of that. And the reason for that is because, as I mentioned, the courts have developed all sorts of ways to say we're not going to overturn agencies. And in other contexts, we're not going to overturn Congress. A couple of the basic buzz phrases in the area we hear time and again that come with a fair degree of irony. The first one is called Chevron deference. Chevron deference is simply a principle that if the underlying statute is ambiguous, such as a provision in the Clean Air Act, the courts should defer to the agency interpretation. Another way of viewing it is the courts should abdicate their duty to properly interpret the law and just let the agency do it. There's an irony to all that because that came about, and it's why we sometimes, our business friends and lawyers, they want to win their cases, and I don't blame them for it, but the irony is Chevron deference came about in a U.S. Supreme Court case in 1984 where Chevron was sued by the Natural Resource Defense Fund, and the claim of NRDF was that a new EPA reg violated the underlying statute. I believe it was the Clean Water Act, and Chevron won the case by persuading the court to defer to the agency's interpretation. And of course, now that's been turned right back on top of us. Another recent case, the City of Arlington versus the Federal Communication Commission, just in recent months, the court said that Chevron deference also applies to the agency interpretation of the scope of its jurisdiction. So you put those two together alone, we got a problem in terms of court action. You couple it with the tendency to want to defer to agencies, because let's face it, if you're a busy judge trying to read the briefs and then understand this is daunting. And it's a lot easier to just close your eyes and say, well, these people at the EPA must be experts in it. We're just going to let them handle it. So while that's important, the shortcomings are also illustrated by a case that the U.S. Supreme Court handed down in June, known as the Utility Air Regulatory Group versus the EPA, where it said that no, the CO2 emission standards, or the greenhouse gas standards, could not be applied to sources emitting greenhouse gases if they were not otherwise subject to regulation because of emission of things like nitrous oxide and sulfur dioxide. But it said if they're already subject to those, which of course is your power plants, go right ahead, EPA. And that was another split decision, but if you're on the losing side in a split decision, it doesn't help. And in that case, the court, in spite of the urging of Justices Alito and Thomas, absolutely refused to reconsider its holding in Massachusetts versus the EPA some years ago, which was the case where the court said, yes, the EPA is supposed to regulate for greenhouse gases. So the court can be important, and it certainly can help, lawsuit action can help to mobilize public opinion and focus things, but I think the question is fair to ask what else might be done. And the things that might be done, first of all, for leadership, we need to talk about the issue, we need to educate ourselves on the issue, we need to educate everybody else about the issue. The legislature can take some of the actions that Ms. Lugo mentioned in terms of saying we're not going to play ball and hold hearings. Our state leaders can and should be out there showing leadership on this issue. And again, it's not easy. It's going to take some time and some study and some work to put the key information together in a digestible form. And the Texas Public Policy Foundation has already come out with some good work on this, and I know they have more in the works. This is the sort of thing that has got to be articulated. And a few observations in terms of this is we don't or should not underestimate the reality of mobilizing public opinion. Now, it's great if the public opinion gets mobilized and then shows up at the ballot box, but even aside from the ballot box, how many countries have we seen in recent years where authoritarian regimes were swayed by massive public, and I'm not talking, we don't necessarily need to get out in the streets and demonstrate, although sometimes that can be a good thing, but to get public opinion mobilized where state representatives hear from their constituents, where congressional members hear from their constituents, and have people, this really is outrageous once you cut through all the mess. I would also counsel that we have to be careful about listening to our friends. And I say that judiciously, but the reality is certain people in the industry, oil and gas industry, are going to like the regulations because they think in the short run it's going to help natural gas. Lobbyists may like some of it because it means more work for them. Lawyers may like some of it. But at the end of the day, what we need is to see through all that and have a clear focus and leadership. So that's all I'm going to say for now.
Speaking of experts, TPPF has an expert here who will be producing, probably to date, the definitive paper on what this Clean Power Plan means and specifically what it will mean to Texas. Kathleen Hartnett-White, are you still here? I saw her earlier. Oh, there you are in the back. So look for that very soon. I know she's wrapping it up. And so she, because of her experience as being chair of the TCEQ in the past, certainly, and working in Washington as well, certainly has very expert insight into this. So we are ready to take some questions, and by the way, I have seen, speaking of things to do, 1 second here, there is an ad on TV now, and it is just a matter, I don't know how many of you might have seen it, but families are having conversations about the cost of energy, and they're saying, no, we have to tell the government we cannot afford higher rates. And at the end it says, you know, the EPA's new plan will not work for us, call the EPA. So that is certainly something we can and should do as a first step, but also good to encourage ads like this, because as I've gone through these listening records for the BLM and the EPA as they go around the country, BLM, I have this report here just on the Texas, Kansas, Oklahoma review, and as they've listened to people, very interestingly, it's almost unanimous every time. People don't want recreation on the property, they don't want hunting, they don't want energy development, and if there is a comment in support of energy development, there's a footnote that says this was from the energy industry people. So we need to have citizens every day, all of us who consume and use and think about our families and future generations and local control, speaking up about these things.